we approach the end of the Achaemenid line of Persian kings, which we're going to do in summing up the last 100 years of the Persian Empire. So tonight will be an end of all of this study that we've done concerning Medo-Persia. Remember, according to your outline, we're looking at the 4 world kingdoms of Daniel's prophecy in Daniel chapter 2, beginning with Babylon, which only took us a message because that's quite a bit removed from the intertestamental period as such, moving down to the Medo-Persian Empire, which lasted for around 200 years, just about exactly 200 years. The first 100 years, not exactly intertestamental period, but the second 100 years would definitely get us down into the period that we would consider an intertestamental period. Now we've looked at 12 kings, beginning with Cyrus, or we're going to look at 12 kings, beginning with Cyrus all the way down to the last king, down to 331 BC. But the 4 most important ones out of all this would be Cyrus, Darius, Hystaspes, Xerxes, our message last week and tonight, his third-born son, Artaxerxes. The other kings aren't as important. Darius the Mede we're counting as one of the 12. He was not a king as such, and he would be important in as much as the book of Daniel contains him. But you'll see after we get past Artaxerxes the first, Longimanus, that we're going to mention a lot of other kings in finishing out this number of 12. And most of these won't be that significant. Most of them not found in your Old Testament. And so you get down whatever you think's important, which will probably be everything, because I don't have a lot about them, because they are not as important as such, since we're studying intertestamental period and Israel and the Old Testament and so forth, as would be people like Cyrus, Darius, Hystaspes, Ahasuerus, and Artaxerxes. The last kings we'll just briefly pass over. Now the name Artaxerxes appears in 2 books, Ezra and Nehemiah. Obviously, when we're getting down to a time that actually is considered to be intertestamental period time, then we're going to be dealing with some of these latter books like Haggai, Zechariah, Ezra, Nehemiah, and so forth. The name occurs in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, not outside of that. Of course, outside in other extant records, but not in our Bible. But all we're saying thus far by that is simply the name Artaxerxes is found. There are at least 3 Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes Longimanus, Artaxerxes Nimon, Artaxerxes Acchus, which we'll give you later on. Or Artaxerxes 1, 2, and 3. And many people have felt that different kings are meant by the different references to Artaxerxes in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Well, what we can say about that is we recognize there are 3 Artaxerxes, but the first one is really coming at the right time. Artaxerxes the first is really coming at the right time to be included in Ezra and Nehemiah, because the other 2 Artaxerxes come after Nehemiah's time. That doesn't prove that there couldn't be a reference to a future Artaxerxes, future from Longimanus, but the odds would be in that favor. Now, I think that we mentioned also, this is just a little side note, we've covered it before, but it has to be placed here under a teaching about Artaxerxes, that in the Septuagint, Artaxerxes is the name in the book of Esther and not Xerxes. Now, I haven't been able to find anyone who knows why, and I don't know myself why that would be there. It couldn't be true because Artaxerxes comes after the time of Esther. And another suggestion that's not made by anyone who knows anything, but also that is not true, is Xerxes was not also known by the name Artaxerxes. Those are two opposite names there. One's a building upon the other, as we give you the meaning, as we'll give you the meaning here in a moment. Artaxerxes is the third-born son of Xerxes. Artaxerxes is coming after Ahasuerus. We gave you the dates, and they're on your chart for Ahasuerus, around 486 to 464. Then Longomanus is 464 to 423. We're past 483 and the time of Esther, and 480 and 479, all along there, the time of Esther. We're past that by a long shot. So why does the LXX, the Septuagint, have Artaxerxes for Xerxes? I don't know that anybody's guess is as good as mine, because I don't have one and no one else really has a guess on why. That's an interesting problem. If you ever find out why, then you can come and tell me. I'd like to know. Why could you make, why? I mean, we're 300 years past the time whenever maybe Esther is being written by the scholars down in Alexandria, Egypt. But could you make a mistake as noticeable as that? Taking the name Xerxes or Ahasuerus right out of the canonical book of Esther and putting in Artaxerxes? If you've got Hebrew manuscripts before you and you're translating them into Greek, which is what they did, then how? No idea. Well, let's go on with some other guesses that people have guessed concerning the appearance of the simple name Artaxerxes. Many scholars, both liberal and conservative, this isn't just liberal, people like Unger and several other notable conservative scholars, their names I can mention and you'd probably recognize them, feel that the Artaxerxes of Ezra chapter 4, verse 7 through 23 is really a reference to Pseudo-Smyrtus. Now these are the same people that feel that the Ahasuerus of the preceding verse is a reference to Cambyses. We mentioned that when we were teaching on Ahasuerus or Xerxes. We're in Ezra 4 if you need to turn there. Well, you do for your Bible studies, Ezra chapter 4. Now, I don't know how many times I've shared with you before that the chronology of Ezra 4 is a little bit confusing and difficult to understand. So you have to come to that realization in the first place before you can even attempt to deal with these allegations about this in 7 through 23 really being a reference to Pseudo-Smyrtus, which takes us back to 522-21 BC. You have to keep up with your dates now. And not the time of Artaxerxes, 464 to 423. And like I said, they're the same people who believe that the Ahasuerus of verse 6 is really a reference to Cambyses. Because they say the contents, you see, we know that during the times of Ezra and Nehemiah, letters are being written by the adversaries of the exiles who now have returned to Israel or to Palestine back to the Persian king saying, now this is a troublous people. They're building this rebellious city of Jerusalem, and you or we both together need to stop these people from what they're doing. We're familiar with those letters that went back and forth from the people who were adversaries of the exiles to the Persian kings. And that's what's said in the end of verse 6. But who's the king? Ahasuerus. Well, his history is given to us over in the book of Esther, and we don't find letters being written back and forth concerning the exiles about their building the city and they're doing bad things in Jerusalem. You remember from old times, the other kings' records have it as such, is a rebellious city, and once it's built, you know what that means. They're going to try to overthrow the Persian rule. The reign of Ahasuerus? No, some people would say Cambyses. That fits better chronologically. In the beginning of his reign wrote they unto him an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. Now we know there were letters in the book of Esther, I'm not saying that, but these were letters stirred up by Haman just because he hated Mordecai. And of course it was a reflection cast upon the whole nation, and they made an attempt to destroy all the people. But not an accusation like we would see here in verse 6, or as we would think that we would see here in verse 6, that would be comparable to the ones made in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So, the same ones who say that say yes, and And when we get down here to verse 7, now we've got pseudo-smyrtus. Now, why they're trying to make that out to be pseudo-smyrtus, I can understand a little bit about Cambyses and Ahasuerus, but why they're trying to make that out to be pseudo-smyrtus, I don't know. If we leave it like it is, verses 5, 6, and 7, then the chronology fits just fine. Because we've got in, verse 5 down to Darius, from Cyrus to Darius, which brings us from 536, we'll just put that date, you could say 538, but from 536 down to 520. Then you see if verse 6 now is referring to pseudo-smyrtus, then that should be back in the middle of verse 5. Because he's coming on the scene before Darius in history, but not in the order of these verses. Do you follow what I'm saying? If you don't, get your chart out. You need to probably have it out anyway, your kings and prophets. We're going to use that here in a moment, and then we'll go into the between the testaments chart as well. But what I'm saying is verse 5 would be from Cyrus to Darius, 536 to 520. Now, forget about some things that happen after that. Still, in chronological order, verse 6 would be Ahasuerus, 486 to 464. That's fine. And then verse 7, Artaxerxes, 464 to 423. You see, all that would be in chronological order. If you start slipping in Cambyses and pseudo-smyrtus, you're mixing everything up. And my point is the chapter and its chronology is difficult enough as it is to understand without us mixing it up more. Already some things appear to be out of order. So you're just confusing the issue that much more by making additional things out of chronological order. So verses 5, 6, and 7 would be in the right order if we'd leave Ahasuerus as that and not Cambyses, and Artaxerxes as that and not pseudo-smyrtus. And of course that would be Artaxerxes the first, not the second or the third. But if you look on your chart to Artaxerxes and go down from that, you see that covered during his period are the two important people. We're looking at their books now, Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, you say, what's, so big or important about that? Well, it's the following, if you can follow all of this. The autobiographical section of Ezra doesn't begin until chapter 7. We've told you this several times before. I'm not chiding you, but I'm just saying, we've told you this. You can, if you really think and follow along, it's easy to see all these things. And it's easy to see some of these problems. So if the autobiographical section begins in chapter 7, by that we mean Ezra is talking about himself and his own times. And from chapters 1 to 6, he starts way back there with Cyrus and Zerubbabel. He's reviewing the first return of the exiles because Ezra in 458 is going to bring the second return. And Nehemiah in 445, 44 is going to bring the third return. If he's looking back, reviewing that down to his day, then how do we have back here in 4, 7 to 23, a contemporary time with the time of Ezra? This would also have to be autobiographical. Then that would throw some additional light on the 12th verse. And that's all I'm going to say about that. And one of these days, if we teach the book, I'll explain more about that. But that would throw additional light on that confusing 12th verse of Ezra 4. How many of you remember that I've said many times that Ezra 4 is confusing? It's confusing in its chronology. And I explained it especially when you jump over to those last two verses. Then it really can get confusing then. But I believe I understand it. I can tell you that. It's not one of these things we have no answer to. If we didn't, well, we just wouldn't. But I believe I can explain. I believe I understand. And I believe that although some things look like they're mixed up, you have to make some assumptions in order to get the right understanding out of it. But you can't just change the Hebrew name Artaxerxes. You can't just change that. Well, pseudo-smyrtus. Well, that's not what the Bible has. So what you'd have to assume there is a textual mistake. But we don't have any evidence for that. You have to have evidence, before you can start changing your Bible around. We don't have any evidence for that. But again, my contention is 5, 6, and 7 are fine. From 536 down to 523 would be the whole time spans that would cover. And it's not 536 to 423 back to 486. It's straight down in order. 536 down to 520, down to 486, down to 464, down to 423, which to me presents no problem at all. The only problem is this biographical thing I'm telling you about, autobiographical. Ezra doesn't start talking about himself and his time. Well, if you look over in chapter 7, like in verse 7, he says, all of this, my return with the exiles, was in such and such time of Artaxerxes the king. That's why some people have tried to change this Artaxerxes. I'm telling you why. They have some logical fault behind it. Just doesn't seem to fit. If Ezra is living during Artaxerxes' time and the autobiographical section doesn't begin until chapter 7, then what about verse 7 of chapter 4? So there's one problem with the occurrence of the name Artaxerxes. Now, be it known that in none of these places do we have Artaxerxes the first, the second, the third. It's simply Artaxerxes. So which one of those are you talking about? It doesn't tell us. By numeral 1, 2, or 3, you're going to have to know some other things beside that. Then there's another verse in the book of Ezra. That's chapter 6 and verse 14. Now look at this and see if you recognize the problems again. Ezra 6:14. Again, right off the bat, you know, we're prior to chapter 7 and Ezra's time. But we'd even be talking about something way back to the time of Pseudo-Smyrtus, although no one tries to make this name that king. The elders of the Jews builded, and they prospered. Now he's talking about after the temple the rebuilding of it has been resumed. Remember, they started in 536 and it was delayed, and then they started again, I believe in 520, and it was completed in 516. So that's what Ezra's talking about. He's not even here during this time. He doesn't come now until 458. They prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. And they builded and finished it. Oh, by the way, what are we even talking about here? What are they building? The temple. The temple. Remember, they first of all try to do their own houses, and God curses them through Haggai for that. They're not so much concerned about the city. That's going to be with Ezra and Nehemiah, as we see in their books. It's the temple has to be built first, so it's the temple. And finished it. When did they finish the temple? What year is that? 516. According to the commandment of the God of Israel, and according to the commandment of Cyrus and Darius. And look at this. What are we going to do with that then? Because Artaxerxes doesn't come on the scene until 464. So that's a problem chronologically. Again, I believe I know the answer, but I don't believe I want to give it. But I'll tell you what others have said about it. You know, why do they change? I ask myself this when I do this type of study. I say, well, now back in chapter 4 and verse 7, you just changed the name arbitrarily, Artaxerxes, to Pseudo-Smyrtus. Guess what? None of them do that here. Why? I don't know. That would fit good to put back 522, 521. That would fit back in that time. I guess that'd really be a year too early, but at least you're getting back in that time from when they started in 520, or resumed in 520 and finished in 516. But what they say is, well, this is referring to a different Artaxerxes besides the one that is contemporary with Ezra and Nehemiah. Well, there are only two other different Artaxerxes, and both of them come after Ezra and Nehemiah, not before. This would have to be Artaxerxes, notice what it said, king of Persia, who comes back before 516. If that's the completion of the temple, it would have to be before 516. Well, we discussed all those kings. Cyrus and Darius and Cambyses and Pseudo-Smyrtus. And then Darius Hystaspes. Darius the Mede we covered in the book of Daniel. There's no Artaxerxes. We haven't covered Artaxerxes before. So I can understand their problem with this. I think that some assumptions have to be made. And we're just not given all the details about the work of Ezra and Nehemiah. some assumptions had to be made concerning especially chapter 6:14, as well as 4:7 through 23. So my conclusion is, I believe that all of the references in the Bible by the name Artaxerxes are to Artaxerxes the first Longimanus, who ruled Persia from 464 to 423. Notice twice as long as his father Xerxes. He was the third born son of Xerxes. Xerxes' name means king. Arta means great. Artaxerxes, the great king. Herodotus referred to him as the great warrior, as an understanding of his name, which is close enough. Now, to keep the three Artaxerxes distinguished, we'll refer to them, first of all, by their periods. We've given you Artaxerxes, the one we're on now, 464 to 423. You can see this on your chart. By a numeral 1, 2, and 3, and by a second name. Artaxerxes the first Longimanus. 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 Longimanus because he allegedly had a longer right hand than a left one. Whether that's really true, no one knows, but he had a real long right hand, that could grip a basketball. The left one, I guess, could maybe get around a softball or something. So Artaxerxes the first Longimanus. Now on your chart, he's most important because he is contemporary with Ezra and Nehemiah. Militarily, he puts down an uprising in Egypt in the year 460, and then in Syria in the year 448. How many of you remember all that discussion we gave you last time about Xerxes and the battles of Salamis and how that relates to the book of Esther? You remember that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That the Persians are trying to take over mainland Greece and so forth. Well, Artaxerxes loses two important battles with the Athenians. And so he surrendered the eastern Mediterranean, which was the only part Persia sailed upon. Remember, Xerxes had to sail throughout eastern Mediterranean to get to Greece to attack mainland Greece. So he surrenders eastern Mediterranean and all of the Persian conquest in Asia Minor. Remember, they controlled a lot of Asia Minor. At the same time, the northern Greek province of Thrace became self-governing, which meant Persia had to pull out of there as well. So technically, with Artaxerxes, we can see the beginning of the period of the decline of the Persian Empire. It didn't really begin to decline with Xerxes. They were just stopped in their attempt to take over Athens and to take over Greece. But they didn't lose battles to the extent they had to give up all of this territory under Xerxes like we see happening under Artaxerxes. So we date technically the beginning of the period of the decline of the Persian kings, which lasts for the second half of the Persian Empire, or 100 years. The Persian Empire lasts from the fall of Babylon in 539 to the last king we're going to come to, 331. Which is just about exactly a period of 200 years. The first 100 years is fine. The second 100 years is a downward spiral. Now, I said before that most importantly for us, he's the king during the second and third return of the exiles. The second one under Ezra 7:1 in the year 458. Zerubbabel had already taken about 50,000 back in 536. And then the third return of the exiles, this is what the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are about. The third return under Nehemiah chapters 1 and 2, in the year 445. Almost 100 years after the first return. You see, the Jews, many Jews have remained over in Persia, over in Babylon, that area. Only a few, relatively speaking, sprinkle back with Zerubbabel. A large number to us, 50,000, but few to the hundreds of thousands, no doubt, that were spread throughout the Persian Empire. So between Ezra chapters 6 and 7, we have a 58-year gap. And with Ezra chapter 7, we date that 458. 458, and we see Ezra, his name is mentioned there in the first verse, Ezra 7 in verse 1. He's a ready scribe in the law of Moses. He's getting together a group of people. And verse 7, in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, from 464 to 458, in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, they make the trip back. He goes back, and you know some of the problems. He runs into problems concerning, they've had problems back in Zerubbabel's and Joshua's day concerning getting the temple built. But since Zerubbabel and Joshua went back so many years before, Israelites have been there in Palestine ever since that time. And of course now we've got the problem that over the years they've been intermarrying with the other nations around them. And this is something that Ezra and Nehemiah have something to say about. Then if you'll turn over to Nehemiah, I said chapters 1 and 2, again we're talking about the same king, Artaxerxes. Now Nehemiah and Ezra are contemporaries of one another. Ezra comes first, Nehemiah comes after that, but they are there at the same time. Nehemiah chapter 1, the last phrase in that chapter, for I was the king's cupbearer. Who was the king? The next verse of chapter 2, the 20th year of Artaxerxes, 464 down to 444 or 445. Now he has had a relative of his come to Shushan the palace. There we're back to that word again. That's 1:1. Telling him some of the atrocities that have happened back with the city and the walls of Jerusalem. And that makes him sad, and the king questions him why he is of this sad countenance when he's never been that way before the king prior to this. And he prays to the God of heaven, verse 4, and gets the green light to go ahead and request of the king that he might return. He's the king's cupbearer, the one who made sure no one had poisoned the king's wine. If anyone had, Nehemiah will die before Artaxerxes gets the cup to his lips. So he's an important man. He wasn't just someone who cut the bread or something. He was one of the most important people. The cupbearer is always one of the most important people in the court. Anyway, we get down to verse 6. The king said unto me, how long shall your journey be, when wilt thou return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. The king granted, verse 8, the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me. And he sneaks, verses 12 through 20 of this chapter. He sneaks out by night and surveys, well, King James says the dragon well, no dragons, but the dragon well and the dung port, and looks at the broken walls of Jerusalem and the gates that have been burnt with fire, and makes up his mind what they're going to have to do. Here you see the problems over in chapter 4 that they have with Sanballat. And really it's in Nehemiah's book we find all of these letters being written back and forth. Then you get over in chapter 8, now we've got Ezra. His name is placed in there. Ezra. And then on towards the end of the book you see the importance of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now there is one verse over in chapter 13, verse 6. And you notice on your chart you have this little parenthesis when we see that Nehemiah had returned to Persia or to Babylon and spent all these 13 or so years here. You see that parenthesis there? Nehemiah's back in Babylon. 445 down to they have 433. This is Kings and Prophets chart. Nehemiah's over in Palestine. Then he's back for a 13 or 14 year period down to around 420, and then evidently he's back again. This would be verse 7. I came to Jerusalem and understood the evil that Eliashib did for Tobiah. This was someone who was a relative of someone who was not good, who's mentioned earlier in the book, and they'd made him a chamber right in the courts of the temple. So he grabbed all of his baggage and his footlocker and everything and threw it out of the room. So we're not going to have anyone living next to the temple who's opposed to us. And they've got the problem of marrying foreign people again, verse 23. So Ezra and Nehemiah, during this period, it's something important that they're having to deal with, is the unequal yoking of the Jews with these, they're Philistines. They're from Ashdod, and then the Ammonites and Moabites. And their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and they could not speak the Jews' language, but according to the language of the people. And during this chapter, this has always stood out to me, because he's always saying, Lord, remember me concerning this. Doesn't want God to forget his good works, which Hebrews, chapter 6 says God's not going to forget your labor of love that you've showed. You see that in verse 14, and then the book ends with that. Remember me, O my God, for my good. He says it in verse 29, says it in verse 22, and all the other places you can find. Remember me, Lord. Remember me.
For the continuation of this message, please turn
God to forget his good works, which Hebrews, chapter 6 says God's not going to forget your labor of love that you've showed. You see that in verse 14, and then the book ends with that. Remember me, O my God, for my good. He says it in verse 29, says it in verse 22, and all the other places you can find. Remember me, Lord. Remember me. Okay, that ends his rule. We're not going to say much more about that. In 423. Now, one other thing I want to mention concerning the end of his rule is, you see the prophet Malachi is extended, they have him from about 438 down to about 415. They don't even have a question mark around it. We haven't really gone into much detail about the extent of Malachi's ministry, and I guess why is because there's not a lot of material in Malachi's book about the extent of the ministry that he has. That's, a fairly long ministry they have drawn out there. We've dated him around 433, I think, in Old Testament introduction, which is not a big deal. That's 5 years or 4 years difference from what they have. But anyway, assuming that what they have is right, assuming that if we're going to date him in Old Testament introduction 433, that he has at least a 10-year ministry, then that also puts Malachi in there during the time of Artaxerxes, which would bring him either down to or down through the end of the reign of Artaxerxes the first Longimanus, which is 423. I guess that's about all the important things on the chart and the important things that need to be said about Artaxerxes the first. But he, along with Xerxes, and along with Darius Hystaspes, and along with Cyrus, not counting Darius the Mede, he wasn't a king as such, remember. Those four are the most important of the kings of the Persians, not only from our point of view, but from the point of view of anyone, because they're just the important kings in the Achaemenid line of the Medo-Persian Empire. For us, because of their importance in the Word of God. Because remember, all of these, Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes, are all seen in the Bible, whereas people like Cambyses and Pseudo-Smyrtus are not, as well as some of these others. Now, if you'll follow along on your chart, I want to wrap up with the 5 final kings, which will give us 12 total. The 5 kings of the Persian Empire. So the next king that we come to, and these aren't nearly as important as before, the next king is Darius II. Or Darius Nothus, Nothus. They had other names. They're not provided for you on your chart, so that's why I'm giving them to you. Darius I what was his other name? Hystaspes. Darius II, Nothus, Nothus. who rules 423 through 404. As you well know, most of the time we just stay with the dates of the chart. Give or take 10 years or anything, that doesn't make any difference, and there's no sense in inventing a lot of new ones if we don't have to. Some of these dates, of course, we've changed in the past for various reasons, but for the most part, we go according to them because otherwise we'd have to change every single date, and there's no sense in having a chart unless you're going to make up your own then. So, Darius II, again, assuming that Malachi goes that far, Malachi would be under Darius II. Assuming Nehemiah goes that far, and that's really no assumption, that's easy to prove, then Nehemiah is living during the time of Darius Nothus. Now, this Bigvi, do you see Bigvi or Bagoas? We're going to come to another Bagoas. Bagoas was a common name. It was a common Persian name in the empire of that day. So when I start talking about a Bagoas here in a moment, don't think that I'm talking about this one, or don't go home and look on your chart later to say, well, Bagoas, there he is on the chart. I wonder if he was talking about that Bagoas. Notice a little comment above. The Elephantine Papyri mentioned Johanan as high priest and Bigvi as governor of Judah during 410 to 408. I don't even know why they give him so much space then, if they say 410 to 408, but we're really not too concerned. A man named Bigvi is mentioned. I believe it's in Nehemiah's book. I didn't really check all this out. I didn't know I was going to go this far about Bigvi. Who's ever heard of Bigvi? Probably no one in here. He's not important like Nehemiah. There is a Bigvi mentioned, and I'm not even for sure myself if it's, the one in Nehemiah's book, if it's the same one that is referred to here on the chart that they say is referred to in the Elephantine Papyri. You remember what that is, the Elephantine Papyri? About the island in the Nile River down in Egypt, and that was discovered. That's a very important discovery. So we'll just assume this is right what they have. Now the list of high priests, well, that's in the book of Nehemiah, I think chapter 12. We'll get into that whenever we get down to one final question that I want to conclude tonight with. But they're listed along the bottom of the chart. Joachim, Eliashib, Joiada, Johanan, Jaddua, and so forth. So you may need now your next chart, and this really, I think they overlap a little bit. Yes, they do, except things are reversed though. The priests are put up now and the kings are put down, instead of the kings up and the high priest down. But if you notice the author, it's a different author, so he's chosen a different method. But I have reference to the chart of the period between the testaments. Again, we've got Darius Nothus. Oh, it's provided. The name is provided there on that chart, just not on the other. Darius Nothus, Darius II. Well, all we can say about him is nothing important happened except the revolts of many of their subjects, such as the Egyptians, continued to happen. They happened in Egypt and Syria and Athens and Thrace, Asia Minor. They happened under Artaxerxes. They continue to happen under his successor, Darius II Nothus. 423 to 404. Okay, the next king. Now we'll say a little more about this because there's some important historical events that take place during the reign of Artaxerxes II. Now we've had Darius I-II and Artaxerxes I-II, also known as Artaxerxes Mnemon. M-N-E-M-O-N. Mnemon. Artaxerxes II Mnemon. 404 to 359. Now he was almost killed by his own brother at the coronation ceremony. He had a brother whose name was Cyrus. And history shows that this Cyrus was a brave warrior, and it's been speculated that if Cyrus would have been successful in killing his brother at the coronation ceremony, Artaxerxes II Mnemon, then since Cyrus was such a brave warrior and such a good warrior, maybe he could have turned the decline of the empire around if he would have come to the throne. But it's pure speculation because of what happens to Cyrus. Now he was pardoned the first time by his brother at the request of their mother, only to plot again later on. And then this chart is going to be good for us because it provides a lot of the extra biblical history. Look right under the name Artaxerxes. At the Battle of Cunaxa in 401, which was a city near Babylon. My memory serves me correct. I think it's 87 miles from Babylon. So within the proximity of Babylon, Cunaxa. Artaxerxes II, Nemon, defeats his brother in battle, Cyrus, and Cyrus is killed. So that's an important battle. The Battle of Cunaxa. 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 You have all this provided right on your chart. Revolt of Cyrus. But see, you don't know who Cyrus is, though. Well, it's the brother of Artaxerxes, Nemon. Then they fight a battle near Babylon, the Battle of Cunaxa in 401. Cyrus is defeated and killed. Artaxerxes continues to rule. But here's the interesting background to this particular battle. If you've ever read the book Anabasis, then you know the history of this. We'll mention Anabasis. It's mentioned there on your chart here in a moment. But Cyrus, remember we're talking about two Persians fighting against one another, two brothers fighting against one another. But Cyrus had a large Greek contingent of 10,000 Greek mercenary soldiers. Remember, these two empires are against each other, the Greeks and the Persians. But Cyrus has gone and hired 10,000. They were known as the 10,000, a famous fighting band. And they were fighting for Cyrus to defeat Artaxerxes II. But when when Cyrus was killed, then that was, of course, the end of the battle, and this Greek contingent of mercenaries, known as the 10,000, have to fight their way back to Greece. You know enough about your geography now to know how far that is. And you know who's going to be on your heels as you're retreating. So sure enough, the Persians under Artaxerxes II, Nemon, follow on their heels. It ends up that all of the leaders of this retreating group of Greek mercenaries are all killed. A lot of these are Persian leaders. Of course, they've got Greek soldiers fighting under them, but they're Persian leaders that were recruited by the guile or whatever, flattery of Cyrus. So all the Persian leaders end up dead. We really end up with nothing but this Greek contingent of 10,000. They select a new leader by the name of Xenophon. Xeno, it's on your chart, Phon, Xenophon. Xenophon is chosen. He is a Greek. You can tell by his name he's a Greek. He is a Greek. He was chosen to lead the 10,000 out of Persia, out of Babylon area, back to Greece, and he leads them successfully over hostile areas all the way back to mainland Greece. And all of this retreat was immortalized in the book written by Xenophon, Anabasis, which is the ancient world's greatest textbook on military procedure, read by commanders of armies down to this day. Xenophon's Anabasis. Anabasis is just a Greek word that means military retreat, I guess is what it means. A retreat. Military procedure in retreat. That's all the Greek word means, Anabasis. Probably never read that book. Have you ever heard of that book before? Anabasis, Xenophon's Anabasis. Everyone's shaking their head no. It's the greatest ancient textbook on military science, military procedure, how to fight a battle, how to lose a battle and get away with your skin intact, I guess. It's an interesting book, though, and it's read down to this day. And it was written by Xenophon, who is the Greek leader who had been recruited by Cyrus, but who, after Cyrus and the Persian generals had all been killed by the forces of Artaxerxes Nemon, had been elevated to the leader of this group, and he should be, because they're Greeks and he's Greek. And he leads them successfully back, and all of this is immortalized in this very good account of their retreat, Anabasis. So that's why you've got those little references under that. That's what they're about. I told you now about Cyrus, about the Battle of Cunaxa, and about Xenophon's Anabasis. Okay, the next king is Artaxerxes III, Ochus, O-C-H-U-S. Artaxerxes III. He rules 359 through 338. Now the empire is heading downwardly very quickly, and he's determined to revive the empire to its full glory under Cyrus. And so whenever he comes to the throne, he kills all of his brothers and sisters to make sure no one poisons him. And he retakes Egypt, which had fallen under Artaxerxes. He retakes Egypt. The retaking sometimes is partial, sometimes it's complete, because sometimes the revolt is partial and sometimes it's complete. But finally he's poisoned without really accomplishing very much. We put him back like Darius II Nothus. He doesn't accomplish much, but he had more of a spirit of adventure and restoration of the empire than Darius II Nothus had. But he's finally poisoned by a member of his court named Bagoas, B-A-G-O-A-S, Bagoas. That name is found on your chart, but we're not talking about the same person, Bagoas. Now, whenever Bagoas, a member of the court of Artaxerxes III, poisoned him, he spared the youngest son, killed all the others, spared the youngest son of Artaxerxes III with the intention of placing him on the throne and using him as a puppet ruler. And that man is Arses, A-R-S-E-S, who rules 338 to 336. Arses. You see, he just stuck in there on your chart, but he's the son, the youngest son of Ochus, Artaxerxes III. He rules 338 through 336. But whenever he showed a streak of independence, then Bagoas had him poisoned too. He thought he was going to use him as a puppet ruler, but once he got on the throne, he liked the taste of power. So when he showed this little streak of independence, then Bagoas, who had killed his father and everyone else, killed him as well. And Bagoas chose a cousin of Artaxerxes III. You see, all of this is straight down in the Achaemenid line of Persian kings. These people are all related. He chose a cousin of Artaxerxes III, who at this time was a satrap of the province of Armenia, who, when he came to the throne, took the kingly name of Darius III, or Codomanus. And whenever he came to the throne, he had Bagoas poisoned. You knew I was going to say that. You got to get to the end of everyone killing everyone. Bagoas poisoned everyone, and he ends up poisoning himself. Darius III, Codomanus, rules 336 to 331, the end of the Persian Empire. His death brings a complete end. Now, there are a lot of other important events and battles that if you just drop down beneath Darius III Codomanus, you see that great king. And I could get into that as a conclusion to the Persian Empire, but I think I'll save that for an introduction to the Greek Empire. So there are lots of, don't just think, well, that's the end. There are lots of things that are going on here. There's the Battle of the Granicus and the Battle of Issus and the fall of Tyre, and all of this is going on that we'll get into whenever we discuss the beginning of the Greek Empire. So, after all this study of the Persian Empire, it leaves us with one more item, and then we'll be through. And that's the identification of the biblical Darius the Persian. The identification of the biblical Darius the Persian. We're giving you a fairly complete study in all of this. I don't know. I think he's probably even on the outline. See, we've covered page 2, We mentioned some important kings, Darius the Mede, Cyrus, Darius the First, Hystaspas. I just don't have all the names down here. Ahasuerus. Then E, this is on page 2 under number 3, Artaxerxes the First, all the way down through the second and the third, and then through Darius the second and the third. Then the last name we have mentioned, the last historical figure, is by the name of Darius the Persian. The name occurs in Nehemiah 12 and 22. Nehemiah 12 and 22. Darius the Persian. Now there have been 4 people by the name Darius that we've studied. Darius the first, the second, the third, and who else? Darius the Mede. So if his name is Darius the Persian, he's not Darius the Mede. So we can rule that out. But which of the other 3 is he? Darius 1, 2, or 3? Well, it could not be Darius the First, Hystaspas, because that's way too early for Nehemiah's date. So our problem involves the latter 2. Why is it a problem? Because the critics try to make this out to be Darius the Third, Codemanus, so that they can prove that Nehemiah couldn't possibly have written his book. You see, there's always a little reason why they want to tell us what their view is, because what did I give you? 336 to 331 is the time of Darius the Third, Codemanus, and Nehemiah is a whole century before that. So that's why the critics try to make this to be Darius III, so they can prove that Nehemiah did not write his book. They try to prove that Daniel didn't write his book. They try to prove that Moses didn't write his 5 books. And I don't know what they do with the rest of them, but a few over in the New Testament, they try to make Paul not writing most of those epistles. He couldn't have written the pastoral ones because he uses different Greek words, like, I couldn't use different Greek words or different English words or different Hebrew words if that was the language that I spoke. But they'll do the same thing over to Paul's writings. The other suggestion that could be made by someone that is not as liberal as those is that, well, what we have here is a later addition to Nehemiah 12:22. But you might be saying, you might not, you might be saying I'm confused, but if you're not saying that, you might be saying, well, what's the problem anyway? If Nehemiah is living 445 in that time, and he mentions in chapter 12 and verse 22 such and such about the reign of Darius the Persian, why do not we just automatically assume that would be Darius Nothus II, which is during Nehemiah's time? I mean, that would just be obvious. Why would you even assume something else? Okay, you're supposed to be asking that. It's because of a statement of chronology made in the writings of Josephus, where Josephus tells us the following, that Alexander the Great, that Jaddua, the Jewish high priest, and that some Darius, the king of Persia, are all 3 contemporaries of one another. You have to get that down, and that's where the problem really originates, with this chronological statement made in Josephus' writings, that Jaddua the high priest, that Alexander the Great, and that some Darius, the king of Persia, are all contemporaries. Now, Jaddua is mentioned in the same verse, Nehemiah 12:22, as this Darius the Persian. But here's what the solution could be. And let me just say before I get to that we did a lot of study on lit tape number 14 about this same verse, but we did it about Jaddua and not about Darius. That's on lit tape 14 if you want to go look in your notes. I gave you, I think, about 4 or so points. We're talking about the conclusion, I believe, on that tape to the Old Testament canon. Then how could we have reference to Jaddua and this Darius the Persian? And I brought in the same statement I'm giving you again now about Josephus, that these 2 men, Jaddua and Darius, some Darius, he doesn't say that he's the third or the second or that he's Codemanus or Nothus. He doesn't say that, but some derive that these are contemporaries with Alexander the Great. And yet still believe that Nehemiah wrote his book. Someone had to have written that after, around 331 BC then, rather than 444 to 5 to 420 BC, which is a century difference in time. So we did a rather extensive study about that. Now we're going to complete it because we're going to say some things about Darius of Persia. Okay, here's what we assume could be the solution. Now, I think I said on that tape we could assume a later edition. That's no problem. That doesn't hurt the inspiration of the book. That doesn't hurt the Nehemiah authorship of the book either. That doesn't hurt that. But there may be even a better solution than that. Nehemiah could have known Jaddua as a young boy. Nehemiah old, Jaddua young. That's what I mean by young boy. Not Nehemiah, but Jaddua. Nehemiah could have known Jaddua as a young boy. Okay, now look on your chart and you see if this isn't feasible. Jaddua, you say, well, Jaddua, that's around 404. Let's make him 405 now, maybe to be safe. I think you've got about 403 if you draw that line up on your chart. But move that a little bit to the left of Jaddua. I'm back on to Kings and Prophets chart because we're going to need a little earlier date here in a moment. But anyway, you say, well, there's Jaddua 405, and the end of Nehemiah's time is about 17. Well, that date of 405 isn't when Jaddua was born. It's when he becomes high priest. And you're not high priest till you're around the age of 30. So if you add 30 years to that, then definitely Jaddua and Nehemiah could have been living at the same time. Which means, thus far, we're okay in Nehemiah 12:22 when he gives us the line of the Levites in the priesthood, Eliashib, Joiada, Johanan, and Jaddua, were the recorded chief of the fathers also, the priests, so forth. In other words, he doesn't necessarily, Nehemiah, have to be living during the time of the high priesthood of Jaddua. This is what we proved on the Lit Tape 14. But since he knew him as a boy, assuming that he's not going to be bit by a rattlesnake or something, he's going to grow up to be high priest. And so Nehemiah puts all of this in his book, which is no problem with us, with me, with anyone who believes inspiration of Scripture. Then we could assume that Jaddua becomes high priest just before the death of Darius II Nothus. And by the way, let me just say this now. Look at all the question marks we have on your chart here. No one knows for certain all of these dates here. In other words, Nehemiah could certainly have lived past the time of 417. That really would even help us more if you could get him to live further than that. But notice the question marks that none of that is certain. Anyway, getting back to what I was saying, Jaddua becomes high priest just before the death of Darius II Nothus, who also was living during Nehemiah's time, which puts all three of them as contemporaries, somewhere in their life as contemporaries. Nehemiah, Darius II Nothus, and Jaddua. But it doesn't put Alexander the Great in that time period. But that doesn't matter for Nehemiah's book, only for the reference that we have over there in Josephus. You see, if he said Alexander the Great, now we've got a problem here. Alexander the Great doesn't live in the 5th century, he lives in the 4th century BC. But here could be the solution. Jaddua, you have to go to your other chart now, could have lived, look at the extent of period they have for him, could have lived all the way down to the time easily. I mean, he would have been an old man, 100 years old, but he could have easily lived down to the time of Alexander the Great. Therefore, in the reference in Josephus, Josephus would be talking about Jaddua, as we know him in Nehemiah 12:22, Alexander the Great, but the Darius would be Darius III Codemanus, which still fits chronologically into this whole scheme of everything that I've said thus far tonight. However, Nehemiah's book, in Nehemiah 12:22, since he's not saying anything about Alexander the Great, he doesn't have to extend down that far. He couldn't. Nehemiah doesn't live that long. Consequently, this mention of the reign of Darius the Persian would be Darius the second Nothus, which means there's no contradiction then between the two accounts, which gives us, to the best of our ability, the identification of the biblical Darius the Persian. He's certainly not Darius the first. If he is Darius the third, it has to be a later addition to Nehemiah's book. But chronologically, what I'm saying is we can prove that Darius the second Nothus will fit in here easily. Okay, with that, we're through with all of the Persian kings. We'll start with the Greek Empire then. Now you can put that little study with Lit Tape 14 where we discuss Jaddo and the high priesthood, which was done several years ago, way back in the beginning of Lit, because remember we've had several 6-month breaks in that class. So that was done several years ago.
Xenophon considered a king?
No. It was a Greek general. A Greek general.